America is waking up to an absolute geopolitical nightmare this morning. The highly anticipated peace talks have completely collapsed. The United States delegation is officially flying home empty-handed, and the Strait of Hormuz remains an active, completely blocked war zone. For the past 21 hours, the entire world has been holding its collective breath as high-level delegations from the United States and Iran sat across from each other in Islamabad, Pakistan, desperately trying to hammer out a diplomatic miracle to pull the global physical economy back from the absolute brink of total devastation. The United States administration treated this as a massive make-or-break diplomatic showdown, sending an incredibly heavy-hitting team led directly by Vice President JD Vance, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and Jared Kushner, who were tasked with staring down Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to force an end to this brutal 44-day conflict. But despite almost a full day of grueling, highly mediated negotiations hosted by the Pakistani government, the talks violently fractured over the exact same irreconcilable red lines that started this massive war in the first place. Specifically, Iran's absolute uncompromising refusal to abandon its domestic nuclear ambitions under the massive threat of American military pressure. Furthermore, the Iranian delegation point-blank refused to bow to American demands regarding the physical global supply chain, explicitly rejecting the ultimatum to immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz to international commercial shipping without first securing a permanent ironclad peace agreement that Washington was completely unwilling to put on the table. The fallout from this catastrophic diplomatic failure was immediate and incredibly hostile, with Iranian officials publicly blasting the United States after the talks broke down, calling the American delegation vile and dishonest, and explicitly accusing Washington of attempting to achieve at the negotiating table what it could not successfully achieve through overwhelming military force. Tehran went on the record to state that they completely reject the American terms and will continue the defense of their borders by any means necessary, whether military or diplomatic, essentially telling the United States that the most critical physical energy choke point on the planet will remain entirely closed until their specific geopolitical demands are met. And the American response to this massive diplomatic collapse was equally aggressive and uncompromising, with Vice President JD Vance stepping up to the microphone to officially confirm that the United States delegation was going back home having not reached any sort of agreement whatsoever, delivering a stark, chilling warning directly to the Iranian leadership. The Vice President publicly stated that walking away from the negotiating table without a deal is bad news for Iran, much more than it is bad news for the United States, sending a very clear geopolitical signal that Washington is fully prepared to let the military take over now that the diplomats have officially failed to secure a ceasefire. But here's the thing. Even while Iranian President Pezeshkian tries to publicly claim that his country is completely ready for a fair and balanced deal to ensure lasting peace, the physical reality on the ground tells an entirely different, incredibly terrifying story of a region that is rapidly spiraling into a massive, uncontrollable escalation. Because almost immediately after the peace talks in Pakistan officially collapsed, President Trump delivered an incredibly aggressive, highly public warning regarding the sheer military capabilities of the United States, explicitly stating on the record that he could take out Iran in one day, proving that the commander-in-chief is rapidly losing patience with these stalled negotiations. This kind of massive, apocalyptic rhetoric from the White House completely sets the stage for a new, incredibly dangerous era of this war, because the administration is now officially forced to choose between pushing for impossible diplomatic miracles with a hostile adversary or doubling down on devastating military action to forcefully reopen the global supply chains. And the failure of these 21-hour marathon talks in Islamabad means that the massive physical blockade currently strangling the Middle East is now guaranteed to stretch on for weeks, if not months, violently choking off the global flow of physical commodities and bringing the absolute worst-case economic scenarios directly to the doorstep of the everyday American taxpayer. The entire premise of these intense negotiations was built on the desperate hope that Washington could quickly secure the Strait of Hormuz and stop the massive bleeding in the global energy markets. But Iran effectively looked the Vice President of the United States in the eye and dared the American military to try and pry the waterway open themselves. So now, diplomacy is officially dead in the water. The delegations have completely abandoned the capital of Pakistan, and the United States government is rapidly pivoting its entire geopolitical strategy to deal with the terrifying reality that the most important shipping lane on Earth is absolutely not going to open peacefully anytime soon. And, as the harsh realization sets in that the peace talks have completely failed, the administration is actively preparing to execute a completely unprecedented, incredibly risky military maneuver right in the middle of the Persian Gulf that is going to send absolute shockwaves through the physical energy markets and completely change the physical logistics of the entire Middle East. Because the moment those grueling 21-hour diplomatic talks in Pakistan officially collapsed without a peace deal, the administration in Washington made a massive, unprecedented strategic pivot that completely rewrote the rules of this conflict, announcing a staggering military maneuver that caught the entire global shipping industry completely off guard. In a stunning turn of events that completely changes the physical landscape of the Middle East, President Trump just publicly announced that the United States military is no longer just trying to forcefully escort commercial ships through the danger zone, but instead, the United States Navy has effectively begun the massive process of blockading the Strait of Hormuz themselves. We are now looking at an absolutely mind-bending geopolitical reality where the United States and Iran are actively competing to blockade the exact same crucial waterway, creating a completely impenetrable, highly militarized choke point that guarantees the physical flow of global energy will remain entirely paralyzed for the foreseeable future. The president made the administration's new strategy incredibly clear to the entire world, stating on the record that the United States Navy will begin actively blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, essentially shutting down the transit of physical commodities across the entire region to regain absolute control. This immediate, highly aggressive naval blockade is deliberately designed to interdict any commercial vessels that attempt to pay the massive $2 million extortion toll that Iran recently demanded, ensuring that Tehran cannot successfully fund its own domestic reconstruction by illegally taxing the global supply chain, while American forces are trying to secure the area. But this unprecedented military strategy is not just about stopping the flow of extorted ransom money. It is fundamentally about taking absolute physical control of the waterway so the United States military can begin the incredibly dangerous, painstakingly slow process of locating and systematically destroying the massive network of Iranian sea mines. And the commander-in-chief delivered an absolutely brutal, uncompromising warning to anyone who attempts to interfere with this massive naval operation, explicitly stating that any Iranian forces who fire at American personnel or at peaceful commercial vessels will be immediately blown to hell by the overwhelming firepower of the United States military. But the Iranian military command is absolutely not backing down from this massive show of American naval force, as the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps immediately fired back with their own terrifying public threat, aggressively warning that they are fully prepared to trap their enemies in deadly whirlpools right in the middle of the Strait of Hormuz. Think about the sheer, terrifying physical logistics of what is actually happening in the Persian Gulf right now, with two heavily armed, incredibly hostile military forces actively operating within a massive, concentrated minefield, both determined to aggressively enforce their own absolute blockade over the exact same narrow 21-mile-wide stretch of water. Geopolitical analysts and military logistics experts are currently looking at this unprecedented double blockade and warning the global physical markets that even if the United States Navy is ultimately successful in securing the strait, this massive mine-clearing operation is going to be an incredibly slow, deeply dangerous process that cannot be rushed. According to the absolute latest intelligence models evaluating the situation on the ground, this deliberate, methodical military strategy to gain total physical control and eventually let traffic flow freely means that the movement of commercial shipping will be severely restricted and choked off for at least another 2 solid months. We are staring down the barrel of 2 more months of absolutely zero major commercial traffic flowing through the most critical physical energy artery on the entire planet, meaning that the millions of barrels of oil that normally power the massive industrial factories and diesel freight trucks of the Western world are going to remain completely trapped. You have to realize that a full-scale naval blockade enacted by the United States is one of the most extreme military measures imaginable, essentially turning the world's most vital maritime highway into a completely locked-down federal jurisdiction, where massive aircraft carriers and guided missile destroyers dictate exactly who gets to move and who gets stopped. This isn't a simple traffic stop on the open ocean. This is a massive logistical nightmare where the United States Navy is now tasked with physically boarding, inspecting, and potentially turning away massive commercial supertankers that are desperately trying to deliver critical physical energy supplies to allied nations across the globe. And the sheer financial cost of maintaining this massive double blockade is going to be absolutely astronomical, forcing the United States military to burn through billions of dollars in fuel, munitions, and operational expenses just to park their massive fleets in a highly contested active combat zone for the next 60 days. This means that the administration's top priority in this war has officially shifted away from simply punishing Iran with heavy airstrikes and has moved entirely toward a desperate brute force military effort to forcefully pry open the Strait of Hormuz before the massive supply disruption completely shatters the American domestic economy. But while the United States Navy prepares to spend the next 8 weeks playing a deadly high-stakes game of cat and mouse with Iranian mines and fast attack boats, the brutal economic reality of a prolonged 2-month physical energy blockade is already violently slamming into the shores of the United States. Because the physical commodities markets absolutely do not have the luxury of waiting 2 months for the United States Navy to slowly clear a minefield, and the massive panic over this failed diplomacy and subsequent naval blockade is currently triggering an absolute catastrophic shockwave straight through the heart of the American middle class. All of this massive geopolitical maneuvering is leading us directly into an incredibly volatile week ahead, where everyday citizens are going to physically feel the devastating impact of this collapsed diplomacy every single time they go to the grocery store or try to fill up their cars with increasingly expensive gas. Because when you completely sever the most critical physical energy artery on the planet for an extended 2-month military blockade, the devastating economic blowback does not wait for the diplomats to fly home before violently crashing into the American economy. We are officially watching the massive, unavoidable consequences of this collapsed peace summit directly manifest at the gas pump, as the failure of the Islamabad talks has triggered a massive, uncontrollable panic across the entire global physical energy sector. According to the absolute latest economic models reacting to the United States Navy blockading the Strait of Hormuz, physical United States crude oil prices are now expected to violently surge above $115 a barrel by the end of this month. To put that massive number into a real-world perspective, we are talking about an immediate, devastating 21% spike in the physical cost of crude oil, which serves as the foundational baseline for every single manufactured good and transported commodity in the country. When physical crude oil rockets past $115 a barrel, it creates a catastrophic domino effect throughout the entire physical supply chain, immediately doubling the cost of the physical diesel fuel that powers the massive freight networks delivering groceries to your local supermarket. It means that the massive agricultural conglomerates tasked with physically growing and harvesting our food supply suddenly face crippling, unsustainable operating costs, forcing them to immediately pass those massive financial burdens directly onto the everyday American taxpayer at the checkout counter. And we are already seeing this massive physical inflation violently rip through the domestic economy right now, with official data confirming that the physical United States Consumer Price Index inflation rate just took a massive, painful jump from 2.4% all the way up to 3.3%. That is a staggering acceleration in the baseline cost of physical survival, effectively wiping out months of careful economic recovery in a matter of weeks, as the sheer gravity of this 44-day war completely overwhelms the domestic supply chain. But the absolute most terrifying part about that 3.3% inflation reading is that it does not even account for the massive 2-month naval blockade that the United States military just initiated right in the middle of the Persian Gulf. Macroeconomic analysts are now heavily warning that if this massive path forward involves continued warfare, further escalation, and a prolonged, heavily militarized closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the United States is rapidly heading toward a crippling 4% inflation shockwave. If physical inflation breaches that massive 4% threshold, it will completely devastate the purchasing power of an American middle class that is already stretched to the absolute breaking point, turning basic physical necessities into unaffordable luxuries for millions of hardworking families. Yet, despite this terrifying trajectory toward 4% inflation and $115 oil, the rhetoric coming directly out of the White House is projecting a bizarre, almost disconnected sense of calm regarding the massive physical energy crisis currently unfolding. President Trump just addressed the American public regarding the skyrocketing cost of energy, publicly stating that the price of oil and gas could be lower before the midterm elections, or maybe a little higher, shockingly admitting that, frankly, gas prices have not gone up as much as he thought they would. That is a staggering public admission from the commander-in-chief, essentially telling the American taxpayer that the administration fully expected the physical energy markets to suffer even more catastrophic damage as a result of this massive geopolitical standoff. When the president openly admits that he anticipated even worse physical inflation, it serves as a massive, chilling reality check for the global supply chains, signaling that the White House is perfectly willing to endure this massive economic pain if it means ultimately securing total physical control over the Middle East. But the everyday citizens actually bearing the brunt of this massive geopolitical strategy do not have the luxury of waiting for the midterm elections to see if physical gas prices will magically stabilize while massive naval fleets are actively hunting for sea mines in the Persian Gulf. They are being forced to navigate a rapidly collapsing domestic economy where the cost of heating their homes, fueling their vehicles, and putting food on the table is aggressively multiplying, while the administration doubles down on a massive open-ended military commitment thousands of miles away. This is exactly why the failure of the Islamabad peace talks represents such a catastrophic turning point in this conflict, because the American public was desperately hoping for a quick diplomatic resolution to stop the massive bleeding in the physical commodities markets. Instead, they are watching the diplomatic channels completely freeze over, forcing the United States into a massive multi-billion-dollar naval blockade that guarantees the physical cost of living is going to get significantly worse before it ever gets better. The administration is actively gambling the entire domestic economic stability of the United States on their ability to successfully clear the Strait of Hormuz faster than skyrocketing physical inflation can completely bankrupt the American consumer. Because while the world's attention is entirely fixated on the massive naval standoff in the Middle East and the skyrocketing price of physical gasoline at the pump, the cascading effects of this energy blockade are quietly destroying the foundational raw materials required to keep modern society functioning. When you violently disrupt the physical flow of global energy, you don't just make transportation more expensive, you fundamentally break the incredibly delicate, highly interconnected global mining and refining industries that rely on cheap, abundant physical fuel to pull critical commodities out of the earth. And as physical crude oil aggressively marches toward that devastating $115 mark, the sheer panic vibrating through the industrial manufacturing sectors is actively triggering a completely different kind of massive supply chain collapse that no one was preparing for. As the massive naval blockade completely chokes off the physical flow of global energy out of the Middle East, the devastating economic blowback is quietly triggering a catastrophic domino effect that is actively breaking the foundational raw materials required to keep modern technology functioning. Because when the physical supply chain of a massive global choke point like the Strait of Hormuz completely collapses, the resulting industrial shortages immediately spread like a virus into the global mining and manufacturing sectors, creating a massive, uncontrollable squeeze on critical physical commodities. And right now, as physical inflation aggressively accelerates and the purchasing power of fiat currency rapidly deteriorates, everyday citizens and massive industrial conglomerates are desperately scrambling to secure physical safe haven assets, driving the physical price of gold to an absolutely staggering $4,748 an ounce. But while physical gold is capturing the massive headline attention as the ultimate hedge against a collapsing domestic economy, an infinitely more dangerous and highly critical supply chain crisis is actively detonating inside the global physical silver market, which is currently sitting at roughly $75 an ounce. You have to understand that silver is not just a shiny metal stored in a bank vault to protect against inflation. It is an absolute, irreplaceable physical necessity for the entire global technology sector, required to physically manufacture everything from advanced military guidance systems to massive solar energy grids. And the actual physical inventory of this critical industrial metal is currently being drained at a completely unprecedented, terrifying pace, with the latest vault data confirming that over 16.6 million physical ounces have been completely wiped out from the registered warehouses in just the last 30 days alone. To put that massive drain into perspective, that single 30-day wipeout represents roughly 5% of the entire physical silver inventory, leaving the registered, deliverable supply sitting absolutely flat at just 76.8 million ounces while global industrial demand continues to aggressively accelerate. But the absolute most terrifying threat to the global physical silver supply is not just the massive vault drain, it is a completely unexpected, devastating domino effect, triggered directly by the United States Navy blockading the Strait of Hormuz. And it is happening right now over in China. According to breaking reports from the global commodities markets, the massive supply chain disruptions caused by the war in the Middle East have triggered a severe physical shortage of sulfur, forcing the Chinese government to officially halt all exports of sulfuric acid starting in May of 2026. Now, if you do not follow the deeply technical logistics of the global base metals industry, you might not immediately realize how catastrophic a Chinese ban on sulfuric acid exports actually is for the physical silver market and the broader technology manufacturing sector. Sulfuric acid is the absolute non-negotiable chemical backbone required to physically leach copper from oxide ores, meaning that when China completely cuts off the global export supply of this critical acid, the entire physical copper mining industry is going to hit an immediate, catastrophic bottleneck. And here is the terrifying mathematical reality that connects the burning Strait of Hormuz to the global silver squeeze. Roughly 70% of the entire world's physical silver is not mined directly, but is actually extracted strictly as a byproduct of base metals mining like copper, lead, and zinc. With copper accounting for roughly 27% of that byproduct supply and lead and zinc contributing another 30%, any massive disruption to the physical extraction of these base metals instantly and violently chokes off the global supply of newly mined physical silver. So the failure of the Islamabad peace talks has essentially triggered a catastrophic global chain reaction, where the Middle Eastern blockade creates a massive sulfur shortage, which forces China to ban sulfuric acid exports, which completely paralyzes the copper mining industry, which actively destroys the global physical silver supply. We are watching the complete interconnected collapse of the physical global economy happen in real time, where a diplomatic failure regarding a 21-mile-wide strait in the Persian Gulf ultimately prevents the manufacturing of advanced electronics and solar panels halfway across the globe. The administration is trying to fight a massive multi-front geopolitical war to pry open the flow of physical crude oil, while simultaneously watching the foundational industrial metals required for the modern American economy completely evaporate from the physical supply chain. I want to know exactly what you guys think about this massive interconnected supply chain collapse. Do you think the United States Navy can actually clear the Strait of Hormuz before the physical shortages completely break the domestic technology and manufacturing sectors? Or do you think this massive Chinese export ban on sulfuric acid is going to trigger an unstoppable, catastrophic squeeze on physical silver and copper that the administration is completely powerless to prevent? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, because this situation is escalating by the hour, and the physical realities of this war are finally hitting the global commodities markets with absolute devastating force. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you do not miss the next massive update. Stay extremely vigilant as these physical shortages continue to ripple through the economy, and I will see you in the next video.